Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The name of the program is World Watchers. It's broadcast number 598. Whoops, take that back. 698. Missed 100 there. April the 22nd, 1985. Last week I was talking about the commotion that was just building up with Ronald Reagan's intention to put a wreath in the cemetery of the graveyard that was the staging area for the Battle of the Bulge. And I cited some good Nazis that are still alive, but he said that hardly anyone over a certain age of 50 or 55 remembers the war, that most of the people were young there, and the others are too old and senile. Well, in the past 7 days, you've heard a lot of commotion, a lot of talk shows, a lot of memories, a lot of hurt feelings, analysis, criticism of his going there, questioning why he's doing it, even Senator Robert Dole saying he hopes that he doesn't do it, high officials like George Shultz suggesting that maybe it's wrong to be making this trip to that particular graveyard. And there has been so much in the news, I'm sure your papers, wherever you live or wherever you see the programs, you've heard at least a fraction of the controversy and know how much there is going on. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of the debates that are taking place. I was going to at first, but I'm going to let the heat cool off for a while. Personally, I think it's just fine that he's going to that particular graveyard at Bitburg. For years, I've studied the Battle of the Bulge. I've shared it with those listeners that follow it every single week. Whenever there's a crisis in the news, people pick up the radio and listen to Kazoo to see what Mae Brussell's saying, and then when they're satisfied with that, they go back to their kind of complacency. But I don't think many people are going to be very complacent in the weeks and months and years ahead. Those that listen every week, as I say, know that I have particularly delved into the Battle of the Bulge, the people who participated in it, the American team, the Hitler team, the betrayal at Arnhem, which preceded the Bulge, the slowing down there. That book was given to me by David Emery, and that turned me into an investigator of the Arnhem massacre prior to the Bulge, because it involved Prince Bernhard, the husband of Queen Juliana of Holland. He was member of Hitler's youth, the SS. Also, he was part of the Hitler Nazi organization, and then he worked for I.G. Farben. And when the Queen took her children, his children, out of Europe for the duration of the war, he stayed behind, in quotes, to work with the resistance. But during that period, and of course after the war with Klaus Barbie and the Americans, he was really working with the people who were betraying the resistance, and all the evidence points to that. Otto von Bolschwing from Holland, who came to the United States, and so forth. They were betraying the people and the resistance and stalling that particular battle to stall the Battle of the Bulge, to get ready to take out of Europe the profit and the art and the gold and everything that Hitler had accumulated, but they didn't get it out on time. Now, for years, I've also, at the same time, shared my research on Ronald Reagan, that brilliant book, The First California, the First Para-Fascist State, I've quoted many times. I've been on the air 14 years, and I have been a continuous Reagan watcher for all of those years. And I don't know when I first got interested in well, of course, when he was governor, those 8 years. But it's wonderful to see a noose going around Ronald Reagan's neck and sinking him on what he calls a heroic gesture or a debt or a request of President of Germany, Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany. Richard Nixon left the presidency. He gave a lot of people trouble through the McCarthy hearings, through the Alger Hiss case, the Rosenberg prosecution. He began his political career in Washington in 1946. It started in the Navy when the Navy was bringing over through Project Paperclip the Nazis, the same Nazis that are going to get Ronald Reagan's nose rubbed into his past because of what he's insisting on doing now. Now, Nixon was removed because of a little piece of Scotch tape, a paper at the Watergate Hotel. Not the anti-war protesters, not the politicians, not the left, certainly not the Ted Kennedys or the Mondales or the Hubert Humphreys that were around. A little piece of paper, supposedly left, they believe, by James McCord, did the trick. Now, this time the Teflon will be broken with a wreath, a few flowers, at the staging place of the Battle of the Bulge, and Ronald Reagan will combine the forces that I have studied, those elements, and as some people are saying on television and writing, the Teflon may finally be pierced, And when Teflon pierces, then the utensil that has been used is not of the same value. You get poisoning and so forth, and you have to throw it away. Now, what was so important that he has to dance the tune of Helmut Kohl? Kohl insisted after it was a celebration, if you can call it that, the cemetery, after the Normandy invasion last June of '84, he insisted on wanting to be included at that party. Have you ever known people personally that just have to be there or they're insulted? Well, one article this week said that he was being very spiteful and that he arranged this meeting with the president at this particular time and date so that he would be included, and he's been planning his inclusion since November of '84. He flew to Washington, and we talked about those. So now that these forces have met together, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany, the current Germany, the past Germany, and Ronald Reagan, the world can start researching more carefully, and the Nazi fascist connections of both of these men to their past and the entire era will become open sesame for people to study from now on. Now, I sent a letter to our dear president today, one of the overnight special deliveries in the little blue packet, and enclosed was a bibliography source material to the letter, and then I sent out 55 letters to members of the news media. Only our particular congressman and senator from California, Senator Cranston, and Leon Panetta, because Representative Panetta knows that I've been doing this research, and I sent this out to Washington, D.C., and I made it very simple, like a C. Dick and Jane textbook, because Ronald Reagan has a very simple mind, and he only understands a few sentence structures, particularly when there's something he doesn't want to know. So I wrote this letter with little boxes, one sentence and then a box, and another sentence and a box, and a third sentence, and a little, each of these boxes has a name, and then down below at the bottom of page 1 is a picture of Fritz Kramer at the Pentagon getting his award in 1970, and page 2 has a picture of Fritz Kramer in the Dachau trials in 1946. I wrote, Dear President Reagan, the most important and pressing issue on your mind seems to be getting the Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, approved by Congress and our allies. And that is that little box. It says Star Wars. German Chancellor Helmut Kohl will visit to push your Star Wars. He will help you, rather, push your Star Wars. So President Ronald Reagan must exchange favors. There is more to this story, and it goes back to the Battle of the Bulge. The most visible spokesman for the Star Wars is Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, former Chief of Defense Intelligence Agency. And then there's another little box, Lieutenant General Daniel Graham. Lieutenant General Daniel Graham shares office space, or did last year, with the most invisible man in Washington, D.C., Fritz Kramer. Kramer was plans officer for the Pentagon for over 35 years, through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Chilean coup, and other battles. Little box, Fritz Kramer. He, if he sees it, sees Star Wars, Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, and Fritz Kramer. Every biography and autobiography about Henry Kissinger credits Fritz Kramer for being his mentor. Kramer, a German, with his wife and new baby living in Nazi Germany during World War II, took Kissinger under his U.S. intelligence role, where their activities began during the Battle of the Bulge. Kissinger is never out of office. Kramer's picture below was obtained from the Pentagon. This was taken in 1970. No person in America has seen his face in articles, books, magazines, or knows his name. Before you leave for Germany to honor the Waffen-SS at Bitburg Cemetery, I want you to hold a press conference in the White House on Friday. Bring Fritz Kramer with you to be seen and photographed for the entire nation, for the entire world, side by side with you. He had a press conference, I'll go into it in a few minutes, in March, the middle of March, with Henry Kissinger, who gets the most attention of any person in the United States. I went on at that time, have FBI Director William Webster fingerprint Fritz Kramer in public, and make comparisons to another Fritz Kramer who was located in the same places during the Battle of the Bulge as Henry Kissinger and his mentor. Both Kramers worked for the same people during and after the war, and page 1 has a picture of the so-called American but German-born Fritz Kramer at the Pentagon. Page 2. Adolf Hitler had a General Fritz Kramer who was as invisible to the world before and after the Battle of the Bulge as United States America Plans Officer Fritz Kramer. I have collected over 2,000 books on World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, the Malmedy Massacre, and the Ardennes Offensive. Little box on this page. Malmedy Massacre, 19,000 Americans killed. In quotes, no prisoners, kill on sight. That's what the Germans were to do. Adolf Hitler's top elite SS stormtroopers all converged at the Battle of the Bulge to meet American Army officials who would, in quotes, take care of them, in quotes, until they started working for CIC, United States Army Intelligence. General Fritz Kramer, Otto Skorzeny, and Sepp Dietrich were Adolf Hitler's most important men to assure a 1,000-year Reich. And I gave 5 books as references out of many hundreds, thousands, several thousand. Hitler's Last Gamble by Nova Court, 1967. Damned Engineers by Janis Giles, 1970. Skorzeny by Charles Whiting, 1972. Henry Kissinger by H. Bloomfeld, 1974. Kissinger and His Rise by D. Hanna, 1974. Little box, General Fritz Kramer, Otto Skorzeny, and Sepp Dietrich. And then I went on, 74 of Hitler's elite were charged with long or life sentences for the Malmedy massacres, including Kramer, Dietrich, and Skorzeny. The first political act of new Senator Joe McCarthy was to make sure all charges were dropped so that these men could be set free. Adolf Hitler's gold, cash, diamonds to fund the Odessa, the 1,000-year Reich, was in the hands of Skorzeny and the United States CIA shared offices in Madrid, Spain. The picture below is from the trials at Dachau in 1946. Kramer, Dietrich, and Skorzeny. And under that, Otto Skorzeny, the Odessa funds, the CIA offices, and the Nazi gold. Then down below, I have a little message for the President and people that I sent this copies of this to. Mr. President and members of Congress, the press, and concerned citizens, if there is any error in my questioning that Hitler's Fritz Kramer and the Pentagon Kissinger Haig Fritz Kramer are not the same person, it was an honest mistake. I've spent 2 years trying to put these pieces of the puzzle of America, world fascism together. Is it a mistake or coincidence that the present president of Germany, Richard von Weizsäcker, is the son of the infamous Baron von Weizsäcker, liaison of Adolf Hitler to Pope Pius XII, or that Baron worked with the Vatican for final plans of United States entry into the Battle of the Bulge? Then final sentences, a couple of them. The world is dying, bleeding, arming, killing, escalating, making coups, assassinations. Please call a press conference before you leave for Bitburg. Bitburg and Ronald Reagan will go down in history. Your fate is sealed, Mr. President. My 21 years research came together last week. The SS Gestapo and the United States President honoring the most brutal forces planet Earth ever experienced, and signed it, Mae Brussell. And then included with that letter, it's on 10 by 14 paper. It's a large, it looks like a poster. I put on the largest size of the copying machine and included a bibliography with where Henry Kissinger's Fritz Kramer was during the war and how he came to this country, and the dates of Ronald Reagan working with Errol Flynn when Flynn was in the Gestapo, Ronald Reagan's career, Klaus Barbie working with Henry Kissinger, John J. McCloy releasing the Nazis, and just put a chronology of some important dates, about 15 or 16 important years, and I put the bibliography of the books that I suggested reading for these sources, a background on Hitler's Kramer, the missing pictures of each of them, of our Kramer in the United States, who was German and still is German, and the other Kramer who worked for Adolf Hitler but disappears in 1948 and is never seen or heard of in any history books, although the other people are. Now, last weekend I went to San Francisco, this last Saturday, and wanted to participate in the marching down Market Street because I think it's very important that people take part in these things. There was a large demonstration in Washington, D.C., and the interesting thing was how many different groups participated and seemed to get along and had to express their feelings about what is going on all over the world. And the one common denominator between all of those things is Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger, who make the policies for all those activities. So I made up several hundred sheets with pictures of the Fritz Kramer in the Dachau trial and the one in the Pentagon. It's a little bit different than the one I sent to the president and members of the press today. And I passed those out, and a friend of mine helped me pass them out. I've known her many years. She was a victim in a concentration camp. Her parents had been killed, both of them in concentration camps. She never has listened to World Watchers and never took what I was doing seriously. And I think last week she began to believe that maybe there was a little bit of truth in what Mae Brussell has been trying to tell whoever wants to hear it for quite a long time. So she helped me hand out pamphlets in San Francisco and explain and talk to different people about what the Battle of the Bulge meant, what these people were doing, and the importance of finding out if, in fact, Hitler's general has run our Pentagon. If I'm wrong, I have nothing to lose, but I've spent too much time and too many years collecting information that I actually do believe this is the same one. If not, I and you, all of us, have a right to know. Now, there's one of the newspapers that was handed out at the demonstrations. It was here, and it was also in Washington from the Workers' Vanguard, a large article, The Contra-Nazi Connections, dated April 19th, 1985. And it goes into John Singlaub and the Special Forces and the secret private armies, the privatization of war, the illegal use of these small mercenaries that came home from Vietnam, and information about how our CIA operatives are similar to the Free Corps of Weimar Germany, and the core of this being John Singlaub of the World Anti-Communist League. Now, I've done 3 broadcasts on that, and I'm going back and refurbish your memory and do some more in a few weeks when some of these other news stories do slow down or blow over. Well, I don't think they will from now on. I think it's open season for a lot more investigation. But this long, long article is about the origin of the World Anti-Communist League and starting in Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek, and the links to Reverend Moon, and it's very important, and it sounds for all the world like World Watchers, and I'm sure that the people who wrote it have worked with the same people who are sharing information with me. But the main thing is that hundreds of thousands of these were passed out in both cities, and I got phone calls from different cities saying that people had these articles, and they were happy, not happy that the news was so bad, but pleased that what they've been hearing from me on World Watchers and maybe picking up a few isolated stories is finally coming together and getting out in the streets, and that people can study it from a historical context, that Singlaub has a history, that Robert K. Brown has a history, that Soldier of Fortune have a history, that it is people that make the difference, just as the former presidents of Argentina are just been charged today for murder and conspiracies. That's what I think we should do in this country. I've said it before. Once you remove those men, if you can call them men, and you bring in another president who is not inclined to have the missing children, the torture, the brutalities, then the whole tone of the country changes. Once they get rid of Pinochet in Chile, the pressure will be off there. And people do make a difference. These aren't historical trends. They are particularly mean people that set the tone of the country. You can see the difference between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. People would say Carter was undecisive. That was a media blitz. But the pressure with Ronald Reagan on is every day there's a new surprise, a new appointment, a new decision, a new invasion, new anger and bad-mouthing and refusing to sit down and talk about situations. People make a difference, and the interesting thing is this article was filled with so many names of people that I know make a difference. Now, for those of you that attend demonstrations in the future, can't do anything about the past, there are certain ways to protect yourself. It's been a long time since I've done this, since the Vietnam period. It sort of slowed down after Watergate and Nixon began to be investigated, and the Vietnam War was over. And I let my guard down. I was going to take a camera, thought it was too heavy to pack because I had all these pamphlets to hand out, and didn't take it. Always take a camera. I used to do that when we were at Fort Ord with the Presidio trial. When somebody came and took our picture, I took his picture, and it was invaluable to show that these agents were photographing you, and you can use it if you want later for lawsuits or whatever. John Reese, the famous agent provocateur who now is running and has-been Western goals, was photographed by people as a street provocateur during the Vietnam War, and smart people who had cameras could take pictures of him taking pictures, and this is what you have to do. Now, we went on a bus, a chartered bus, and I assumed that we would be in a parking lot where it would be filled with a lot of chartered buses. They said, be sure and identify your bus number 1069 because there are so many there. And with 50,000 people or so, you can believe that you would expect a sea of buses. And we were supposed to be at a certain corner at 3:30. Well, I was at that place, and another lady was there, and then two others came, and there was no place for a bus to pull up. He just pulled up on the curb, and we got on. There was only one bus, and it was our bus. I don't know where all the others went, but ours was at one place, and we were waiting in front. And I was talking to this lady, and I looked up, and a man was there taking my picture. And it took me by surprise because we weren't in the middle of anything. There was no street theater. There wasn't anything interesting going on. And he wasn't disguised as the kind of person that usually they melt into the crowd. They don't look super straight. He had a blue suit and, black or blue shoes. And just standing there with that camera aimed at me. And I almost yelled. I didn't do that. I just looked at him like, what are you doing? So he took the lens and then turned it to the woman to my right as if, well, I won't bother with you. But with a wide-angle lens, he could have, a full distance of a block on each side. And I just looked at him, really hard. I was angry because there were just a couple of us, and there was absolutely no reason, except for 2 hours I'd been handing out these papers and talking to over 100 people about Kramer and Kissinger, going down Market Street, walking for 2 miles. Every time there was a signal, I'd stop and give out more. 2 hours before the march. And I was looking at him very angrily, and he looked at me before he left, and he just said, well, all good things have to come to an end. Now, I don't know what that means, whether he means we had a nice day or whether he means I have to come to an end. He was arrogant, and I almost ran up the street after him, and I didn't. But the point of this story is that these people are right there. They're right on your tail. I had a lot of time to talk about Kissinger and Kramer, and I admit it's dangerous, but I admit they're dangerous, and I took my chances. Now, there were a lot of articles about Helmut Kohl and forcing the Star Wars. Reagan wants to pay the debt back, of course, and go to the cemetery. One was U.S. officials criticized British Foreign Secretary because he made a statement against the Star Wars proposal or question, and our famous Richard Pearl, this U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, chewed him out and said, how can you dare publicly to talk about the Star Wars, but publicly Helmut Kohl is pushing the Star Wars. There was several stories last week. Kohl called Star Wars necessary. Stop short of taking a direct role, but it's necessary. And he's the spokesman, whereas the Washington Post and the London Times and other newspapers are questioning some of the people are asking questions about Star Wars. And Weinberger has given a 60-day ultimatum to the Europeans that they have to go along with it. Now, not only is the Star Wars something that has not even been discussed fairly, it's been exposed as a first strike for World War III, but along with Mr. Fritz Kramer's partner, Daniel Graham, and Edward Teller pushing this, there's always Henry Kissinger lurking in the background, and he had press conferences about be hard on the Russians, don't rush into a summit, and so forth. A writer from, this is from the Kansas City Times, picked up a story by Sandy Grady, sent to me by a subscriber on Dr. Kissinger. And this is why that letter I wrote to the president and the media, I think, is very, very important, is that some people are catching on to the celebrity status of Kissinger without understanding why. And he has the ultimate power in Washington, he and Kramer and Daniel Graham and Edward Teller, so that the Allies either have to go along or shut up or publicly be scolded like a bunch of children if they don't say, yes, Caspar Weinberger, you're great, we'll do anything you want, spend anything you want. Now, this story says Dr. Kissinger is still on call. And it says celebrities come and go at the White House, but all of a sudden there were TV cameras looming. There was a mystery guest. Who would it be? They couldn't imagine. None other than the important Henry Kissinger himself. Henry Kissinger was having lunch with the president. and it tells about Henry Kay, the one-time star of such epics as Chile, Vietnam, Cambodia, the Doonesbury comic strip, the man with whom Nixon prayed in the White House rug. No wonder hearts beat like trip hammers. And it tells about the television reporters all getting ready for Kissinger, staking out the lights and treating him like a superstar celebrity. He had lunch with the President of the United States. That was on Wednesday, March the 14th. And just a day later, about 2 days later, the President of Brazil had what was supposed to be appendicitis that ended in his demise, and I'm going into that today, a little more about that. But Kissinger has lunch with the president first. There's a picture of them eating lunch, the two of them at a table, both grinning, a very important meeting on this particular Wednesday, and then reported, and he meets the reporters as if, I have nothing to hide, all the cameras are going. And this article by Sandy Grady says Kissinger goes before the camera, and it was just like the old days where he would go to foreign capitals as the prime minister of the world. Nothing changes. Henry the K still dominates the stage. The Kissinger phenomena never stops. At 62, 8 years out of power, he's a kind of shadowy Secretary of State. Books, including his own, bicker about his own role in the overthrow of Chile, the widening role of Vietnam, Richard Nixon's wiretapping, and other dark episodes. But who cares? In America, diplomats who make mistakes wind up as tenured professors or wealthy and famous like Henry Kissinger. He's a star, all right, the hottest money-making machine since Gone with the Wind. A Kissinger lecture costs $20,000. If you're a member of his corporation, 15 or 20 corporations who hire him as a consultant, you pay $150,000 a year. His books sell 500,000 copies. There's no demand for Dean Rusk, William Rogers, Cyrus Vance, or Al Haig. Who is Dr. K that such a magnet for money or clout can be drawn by Henry Kissinger? And of course, I believe that the magnet is the actions that he's done, whether it was Guatemala or Iran, for Chase Manhattan, for the Defense Industry Security Command, for the OSS, the CIA, his links to Otto Skorzeny, to Klaus Barbie, to the top Nazis. He knows all these stories, and he is used on NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN. He is Mr. Media. He is Mr. Bloodbath. And that, again, is why it is so important to find out about his mentor. What gives Henry Kissinger the power through every administration, in and out, to do the things he is doing? Now, I've talked about last week I mentioned some good old Gestapo members, SS Gestapo and Waffen SS, and I'll do more about their meeting. They're having a meeting, a reunion, an annual reunion while Ronald Reagan is there, just to add a little guilt to the little, pad the lily a little bit. They have to have a simultaneous reunion to call attention to themselves, and this meeting will give them the approval to go on and arm and rearm their children and their grandchildren. And I want to talk about some other Nazis that came out in the news this week that I'm sure you saw, but I want to share them with you. There's just one item from the New York Times in the religious section, April the 6th, I want to bring out before the first half hour of this program is over. It says in big black letters, Christianity is blamed for Nazi Holocaust. A Church of England bishop said in a recently published article that Christianity must take a major share of the blame for the Nazi attempt to exterminate the Jews. John Baker, Bishop of Salisbury, one of the church's leading theologians, said that Christianity spewed out anti-Semitism from the earliest times. Now that's what I was saying about Helmut Kohl. If he wants to forget the past, how the Jews still bear the brunt of the crucifixion of Christ, that is what is happening. And he said no matter that Jesus was a Jew, that thousands of Jews formed the first Christian churches, that the Jewish scriptures constituted for nearly 200 years the only Christian Bible. The Jews were those who had rejected and killed their Son of God, they were told, and into that indictment Christians could funnel all their hatred and humiliation they themselves felt at having been rejected by Judaism. That is coming out of England, a particular pastor who has figured it out, that if you want to forget and forgive, you better go back to what are the origins of your hatred of the Jewish people, and it comes from the Christian religions that have then taught it to the Muslims and arm the Muslims and encourage Jews to have Israel as their homeland and push the Arabs out and not participate in finding homes for the Arabs so that they also would hate the Jews. The Muslims and the Jews used to get along. They're both Semites, and they did used to get along before Hitler, before the war, the Grand Mufti of Hitler, before the Western cultures split them apart. We'll take a 1-minute break and then go back to some very important new Nazis in the news, and then I want to talk about the death of the president of Brazil. This is part 2 of broadcast number 698. It's Mae Brussell. The program is called World Watchers. In case you picked it up in the middle, it's a 1-hour broadcast of news and analysis of news events. This is April the 22nd, 1985. Just at the end of part 1 of this broadcast, I mentioned the death of the president of Brazil. He never was made the president. The vice president is now the president, the one who would have been the head of that country, the first democratically elected president in over 20 years, died before he was able to take the oath of office. And I will do more about him. As I say, he was not the president. But before that, I want to mention 5 members of the royal family that are now involved with relatives who were high up with Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Hermann Goering. And you'll hear more of these families as time goes on. This is just beginning to burst open, this story. It started this last week with Princess Michael of Kent, whose father was in the SS under Hitler. She tried to cover it up by saying it was an honorary membership, but that was proven to be a lie. Baron von Reibnitz, Reibnitz, played a very active role with Hitler in the Gestapo. He had a rank of major. This is Queen Elizabeth's first cousin, Prince Michael, and it's her son's wife, a first cousin of Prince Charles and Lady Di. This woman's father joined the Gestapo in 1930. He was close to Hitler's right-hand man, Hermann Goering, the one whose yacht, after the war, was available to the British royal family and the Dutch and so forth. He was married at the time he was an Austrian ambassador to Russia in 1941 and spent much of the war on the staff of the SS Gestapo. His headquarters were in Breslau, Silesia, and now it's become part of Poland. He left the SS, this according to the history, in 1944 to fight on the Russian front, and the SS ran the death camps where the Jews, the Russians, the Gypsies, the political activists, the people who objected to fascism were, of course, swept away and killed. The second story about the Nazis is Prince Philip's sister's husband. Queen of England's husband has a sister, and her husband is Prince Christoph of Hesse. He just passed away recently, but his son is still alive. Not recently, I take that back. He was killed in 1943. It was the Michaels of Kent, his father-in-law, her father, that just died recently. This one was killed during the war in 1943. He was a close aide of Heinrich Himmler. The other one was with Hermann Goering, particularly. And he worked with the SS Gestapo and the Order of the Death's Head. These were the horrible people that planned the worst methods of the final destruction of the Jews, particularly to erase the world of all Jews. They organized the death camps, and Christoph was the head of the espionage network during the 1930s that gathered intelligence for Nazis and for Hitler and prepared for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So they were perfectly willing to undermine otherwise good democracies and throw them into the hands of Adolf Hitler, and he was betraying the people in Czechoslovakia, making way for Hitler to go in there. His son, Prince Rainer, Rainer, is alive today, Rainer of Hesse. He's a first cousin to Prince Charles also, and he confirms that their family was very close to Adolf Hitler. He confirmed that. Prince Christoph had joined the SS in 1933, the other one in 1930, and while Prince Philip was serving in the war, fighting the Germans, the Nazis, and the Royal Navy, his sister's husband was closely connected with the Order the Death's Head and with Himmler and with Hitler. So the cousins were each on different sides, but they're very close and never have had any differences. Prince Rainier said that their relationship with the royal family was never damaged by his father's activities from the 1930s to the Second World War. Now, the third member of the royal family to be exposed this past week, Prince Philip's uncle. Now, some of this has been in books, but people have not had it on the evening television, the Associated Press, and the wire services. Prince Philip's uncle, that's the current the husband of Queen Elizabeth, his father's brother, the Duke of Charles of Coburg, Coburg, was Hitler's ambassador to Great Britain before the war, before Hitler invaded Poland, and he was a lieutenant general in the SA, the stormtroopers, in Hitler's notorious stormtroopers, and he was with Hitler until the end of the war, until 1945. The fourth person involved from the royal family is Prince Wilhelm of Hesse. He's a cousin of Prince Christoph. This is on the Duke of Prince Philip's side. Christoph is on that side. The Duke of Kent's on the Queen's side. He's Prince Philip's brother-in-law. He was captain in the SS Order of the Death's Head for Adolf Hitler and the people that guarded the concentration camps. The fifth person involved this week is Prince Christoph's elder brother, Prince Philippe. It's also, there's two Philips here, spelled or look alike. The brother-in-law of Great Britain's Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth's husband. Again, he was a friend of Hermann Goering's, and he was responsible for organizing the robbery and confiscation of Europe's art treasures for the Austrian museums. Now, as I say, just a year ago in May, no, that's 2 years ago in May, in 1983, I was talking about SS Karl Wolff and Walter Rauff and the use of the yacht and the sequestering of Hitler's gold and their art treasures, and the people involved with the Hitler Diary were obviously very much involved with the royal family in Great Britain or the relatives of the present husband of Queen Elizabeth, and from her husband's side and from her side, and you can see how much clout Adolf Hitler had. People don't like to admit that seamy side, although they know the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were close to Hermann Goering and the Nazi regime. I have 4 books that I have started reading simultaneously. Different parts of them haven't finished yet, and I'll share with you as time goes on. One is called The King Over the Water, The Scandalous Truth About the Windsor War Years Down in the Bahamas. It has to do with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. He was Edward VIII. He was kept out by Winston Churchill and moved to the Bahamas because he was so pro-Nazi during the war, and Winston Churchill was the one who guided Great Britain through those terrible years until the victory over Adolf Hitler. Axel Winter Grant had Nazi millions to buy Mexico, and he bought up the Duke of Windsor, and The King Over the Water is on the murder of Sir Harry Oakes and the downfall of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor because they were involved in that murder. Another book, Who Killed Sir Harry Oakes, by James Leeser. It says the cast of characters: Sir Harry Oakes, the billionaire, the world's richest man, and it lists a few. The Duke of Windsor, that was Edward VIII, the one whose cousins were involved with the Nazi Gestapo and so forth, Meyer Lansky, Charles Lucky, Luciano, Tom Dewey, and so forth. Another new book that just came out, I got 2 that were published. One was in England, one has come out here, but not much publicity. The Windsor Secret, New Revelations of the Nazi Connection by Peter Allen. Stein and Day published that. The Windsors greeted by Hitler at Berchtesgaden. So the royal family was very close to the shenanigans, the Himmler, Goering, Hitler connections, all of them, where it was made to think that Edward VIII was the lone pro-Nazi. It seems that the entire family has been involved, and now it is finally, as I say, making some news. It should make the news so that people be aware that these people have sworn this oath for 1,000 years, and they haven't necessarily given up. There's another book, Operation Willie, The Plot to Kidnap the Duke of Windsor, came July 1940, and the cast of characters, of course, has the royal family and the Duke of Kent and the various members of the family run through these books, the bartering with them, the liaison of them, the father of the Prince Michael, who was working with Adolf Hitler's team, Mr. Goring, and with Edward VIII down in the Bahamas. So you'll be hearing more about this. For years I've talked about Nazi connections on my radio programs when nobody else was saying Nazi. So now I have company and I'm not alone. And I think you'll find it very interesting to see how this country has been sold out, and you'll be able to see it a little more clearly as time goes on, as the developments of these real traitors begin to surface. Now, as I say, Henry Kissinger had lunch with Ronald Reagan Wednesday, April the 10th, 1985, and it got in the newspapers April the 14th and 15th. The two of them smiling up at the White House, a single rose in the middle of the table, obviously posing, and their napkins folded on their plate, ready to munch whatever it is they eat. And right after that, just shortly after that, a month and 1 week, the news came out: Brazil's president-elect dies after 70 operations. President-elect Tancredo, Tancredo, Neves, Neves, thwarted by illness from becoming Brazil's first civilian leader in 21 years, died after undergoing 7 operations since March the 14th. The first operation began just at the time that Herr Kissinger and Ronald Reagan were having their little lunch. 4 days later, but the same day their pictures in the paper, that's when his surgery began, actually the 14th, and he was supposed to have been sworn in on the 15th, and he died April, it was in the news, printed up April the 22nd. On April the 5th, Ronald Reagan was asked at his press conference he had on Central America. The question was, President-elect Tancredo Neves of Brazil was operated today for the 5th time, and the reports of his health are not very hopeful. Do you have any comment on that? Ronald Reagan: I'm having a little trouble because I ran out of a battery. Question again. The President of Brazil. Reagan: Oh, the President of Brazil. Oh, I'm sorry. Question again. Do you have any comment on that? Reagan: I certainly don't want to. Yes, I do. I think that this was a great forward step for Brazil, and all we can do is hope and pray for his well-being. A great forward step. And of course, the news at that time period was saying Brazil's new rulers face prompt testing. Another one, Washington Post: Neves' illness threatens the Brazilian hopes for a fresh start. And then an article sent to me from a listener: Washington report on the hemisphere: Brazil is the democracy in crisis. As Mr. Neves went under surgery for the 5th time in less than 3 weeks, it seemed that with his health so grave, that was a bad sign for the country, for a nascent democratic government that was just about to begin. Another article, several articles when he was first operated on: a medical emergency, San Francisco Examiner. Tancredo Neves underwent emergency surgery today. This was March the 15th. The surgery, I suppose, was on the 14th. Vice President-elect Jose Sarney, Sarney, will take over in the interim. Until last year, that's 1984, Sarney was the head of the military regime. He changed parties and then became the vice president, and he's now the president. It said the doctor said the president-elect's condition was very good. The medical opinion was the most optimistic possible. Mr. Neves might be discharged as early as today, the day after the operation. There's no reason to worry, they assured the people. The first reports said that he suffered from appendicitis. Then another story: Brazilian president is ill. He misses the swearing in. This is on the 16th. The newly elected president underwent surgery Friday. He missed the inauguration, but the transition went ahead. Attending the services was Vice President George Bush. A chant was going, "Go home," greeted Bush and Langhorne Motley, Motley. You know him from Central and South America and his role in repressions in those countries, as well as George Bush's role with the murder of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett right in Washington, D.C. Motley is Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs. They were yelling to him, "Go home, go home." Another story: civilian takes office today as Brazil's president, and it tells how the Brazilian armed forces stepped down Friday after 21 years in power. Just a few days ago, Mr. Neves heard himself being compared to Moses. Your Excellency has given the Mosaic mission of leading this people to the promised land of justice, peace, work, and love. That was 2 days before his so-called appendicitis diagnosis was given, and then he was put in the hospital. It said that he replaced the military dictatorships. There were 5 generals since 1964, and now this was a chance for him to succeed. The New York Times said the dark side of the economic model in Brazil was neglect of social needs. When he came into office, or would have come into office, Brazil's health, nutrition, education, and housing standards are no better than those of Central America. The jobs fell behind, and they grew from 80 million people to 130 million in 21 years. Almost all Catholic country, and the Pope violently fighting abortions. 130 million. Then another story from the Los Angeles Times, Neves stricken on the eve of his inauguration. It says Mr. Alves, a politician close to Neves, said that the attending physician said he will be able to assume the presidency within a few days. He's doing fine. Neves had enjoyed good health during the last 6 months. He actively campaigned for the presidency. But on Thursday, he attended a Roman Catholic Mass offered by Archbishop Jose Revende of Belo Horizonte, the same capital where Jim Jones specialized and did his CIA work, just coincidental, of course, the capital of Neves' home state of Minas Gerais, Gerais. Neves flew to the national capital in the afternoon. The president-elect was stricken at his home during the night. He was with the Roman Catholic Archbishop at Belo Horizonte and got sick in the night with what was supposed to be appendicitis. Now, I say, as I did as early as September 1978, that John Paul I was murdered. The book In God's Name by David Yallop that came out in 1984 goes into that extensively. I was 5 years ahead of that. This Mr. Tancredo Neves was murdered by the same people, and the people that he worked with were William Casey, Vernon Walters, William Simon, George Bush, of course, and Henry Kissinger, and the people that did not want him, of course, to succeed, but his new vice president, the vice president that is the president, was one of their military until a year ago, and just at the time he is to take office and be sworn in, 2 days before, he has a little party in Belo Horizonte with the Archbishop, and he gets sick in the evening. Now, this parallel is very similar to Evita Peron, that book, Evita, The Life and Death of Evita Peron, that I referred to, came out in 1979. And this tells about her sickness because she was to release that Nazi gold, but the parallels are similar. I just want to run through it very quickly. At the height of her power, Eva Peron had been very healthy. The first sign of trouble came in January 1950 when the First Lady was hospitalized for what was officially described as appendicitis operation. Eva never appeared to heal properly. She got paler and more nervous. Juan Perón, of course, wasn't worried. She was worried, and he told her, the doctor said there wasn't anything to do about it. She was fine. Her family began to complain, and she began to complain that she was being used by Juan Perón. Every day she dragged herself to the office, and it said she kept new money to hand out to people. It was delivered to her to make her appear she was still charitable. But by the middle of 1951, and she had a lingering death, this took a little while, like Martha Mitchell. It wasn't a sickness that this poor president had, would-be president. I want to call him president because I think he should have been president, but it wasn't that kind of a situation. Oh, there was one other article I just wanted to mention, that the doctor who took care of him brought a special medicine from the United States and administered to him. He was from Boston and flew down to Brazil to administer this special medicine for his infection. And that added to the original problem. Well, Evita Peron had not a quick death like that, but a lingering one. And this book says how there wasn't any hope, and there was speculation about Eve's last illness. The diagnosis in the press at the time, it ranged from acute leukemia to uterine cancer, and she died of, some people said she died after the after effects of an explosion in her bathroom, a bomb. There also is an article saying that Mr. Neves died from a shot in the stomach, and we'll never know, but there were the same discrepancies. And then it goes into the large tumor she had, but she was very well. She had what was supposed to be appendicitis, what is a somewhat simple diagnosis, and then her illnesses did her in, and then Perón wheeled her out to give a speech in May of 1952, wheeled her back. Evita Peron was dead, and then the Martin Bormann money of Otto Skorzeny and Walter Ralph and Sir Ulrich Rudel and all the top Nazis were able to swing in the 1950s from 52 on with their money. Now, I mentioned last week the article, a very important story from the Washington Post, Brazilian Bank Regime Crumbles by Richard House. This is March the 31st. Maria Bernardo Garnero, Garnero, was at the peak of his investment banking career. He was untouchable in 1982. He had been chosen to welcome President Reagan on a visit that Garnero had been responsible for. He was head of an association with New York financier William Simon, a Knight of Malta, a former Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary of State George P. Shultz when Shultz was executive of the Bechtel Corporation. He was named 1984 Man of the Year by the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce in New York, and now he's been trapped from his perch with a sudden upheaval this month, a casualty of a powerful anti-corruption campaign launched by Brazil's new civilian government. The first day in office, March 18th, Finance Minister Francisco Dornelles, Dornelles, ordered the liquidation of Garnero's company and began legal moves to have him arrested for alleged financial fraud involving $68 million. Now, this is March the 18th, when the would-be president has already been sick for 3 days and didn't ever make the inauguration. The government alleges that Garnero owes $5.4 million in unpaid taxes. There are strong indications under the criminal code that he could be prosecuted. If convicted, he would be the first Brazilian banker to go to jail for financial crimes, despite what the government said was a long-standing pattern of financial fraud and corruption in the past 20 years in Brazil. The new government of President-elect Tancredo Neves has replaced a 21-year-old military administration unable to account for billions of dollars of missing state funds, and Neves has called the financial corruption one of the most hated symbols in the abuse of power. Nobody went to jail in the past 20 years, and now we're going to change this, he said, because of the ethical questions, and of course, Garnero is dead. Neves, the would-be president of Brazil. Garnero is the one who was doing the problems with the money. Garnero ignored the fundamental shift in values in Latin America and continued under the military rule to have accumulated numerous illegalities, the siphoning of funds from his investment bank into phantom companies. His flagship was called the Brazil Invest, one word, Brazil, BRASILINVEST, Brazil Invest. It was 61 among the largest firms, and it was strong part of the investment bank BBI, set up 10 years ago to bring in over $1 billion in loans. Now, this investment company was set up in Salzburg, Austria, with Mr. George Shultz and Mr. William Simon. They were what they called unpaid advisors to Brazil Invest. Shultz cut his relationships because in 1982 he became Secretary of State in the Reagan administration, or worked for them, replaced Alexander Haig. But William Simon, a Knight of Malta, of course, a friend of Garnero's, is still associated with him. The Justice Ministry issued a restraining order on the assets of Garnero and 10 Brazil Invest advisors, including Helio Smith, MSIDT, and Wolfgang Sauer, SAUER, the president of Brazil's international airline Varig and a Volkswagen Brazilian subsidiary. Garnero's wife owns 22% in Volkswagen subsidiary. Garnero earned a seat on the company's board and amassed a fortune of $52 million. Now, the Volkswagen in Brazil was under the control mainly of a Mr. Wagner, the gentleman who fled to the police department the night he was photographed at celebrating the birthday of Adolf Hitler. And at that time, this is the information that I had received, that Adolf Hitler had attended that party, and from then on didn't go back to Argentina, went to a sanitarium in Switzerland, and Wagner went to the police department for protection because they were both photographed together at that particular party. Later, Wagner, quotes, commit suicide. He was part of the Volkswagen, the head of it down there, and this Garnero's wife had 22% of the Volkswagen subsidiary. The article says Garnero was not the first man mentioned with the debt crisis. The first one was a shipyard owner, Paulo Ferraz, who's also dead. They said he committed suicide in February when the story of his money and his creditors came out. And this $545 million loan that the state was supposed to have that he skipped out on, and he is also dead. So one has fled and is not around Garnero. One is dead, and the would-be president of Brazil is dead. Aware of the Brazil Invest impending collapse, Garnero sought into their group using $33 million worth of paper from his own bank, and he created a network where various banks would collapse worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And because they were so big, like the Continental Illinois, he thought the government would bail him out. But instead of bailing him out, they voted a new president, the vice president being a man from the former military, and the president is dead. Now, Executive Intelligence Review, April 16th, had this story. Brazil asked Uruguay about dirty practices. The Brazilian government has asked their neighbor Uruguay to answer questions about their role in the asset stripping of a major Brazilian bank, Banco Sul-Brasileiro, Sulbrasileiro, Baleiro, that was put into receivership. It went bankrupt, leaving a $300 million hole. Brazil's acting president, Jose Sarney, because the other president is in the hospital with an appendicitis that has 7 other diagnoses as time goes on, he seems to have made a deal with Congress that the government would make one more expensive bailout if the Sul-Brasileiro directors were jailed and tried on criminal charges. Their trail led to Uruguay, where they recently placed loans to fraudulent shells. Uruguay is known as the Switzerland of South America. During World War II, the titled families among Hitler's supporters in Central and South America chose Uruguay for safekeeping of their gold hoards, and this is where Nazis would put their money and go after the war. After the war, the flow from Eastern Europe increased, and Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of the illegal Freemasons, P2 Lodge, carried the fortunes of Italian fascists down to Uruguay. In 1982, Gelli was found to have filled an entire Montevideo building with his offices. Now, this is also the state in South America that is run by Reverend Moon. This is where his millions are, and Moon worked with Mr. Mengele, Joseph Mengele, who probably was at the operating table at the time that this poor would-be president of Brazil was being operated on, that became a horrible mess with 7 surgeries. In another newspaper story, this is from New Solidarity, which interestingly enough always is ahead of their time in making certain connections. They have Schultz's pal caught and Brazil Invest scandal. Mario Garnero, the best friend in Brazil of Secretary of State George Shultz and former Treasury Secretary William Simon, is on his way to jail. Why doubt that, now that the would-be president is dead? The new government picked this company for punishment, it says, and it goes on, it was founded in Salzburg, and it tells about the manipulation of money, and the idea was to make a consortium and to loot and choose industrial, agricultural, mineral properties in Brazil, to get a consortium of Americans such as George Shultz and William Simon and pour this money down there. And a good hunk of it was supposed to be put in the first women's bank in New York to have an in-house money for laundering and helping the royal families down in South America. Henry Kissinger had invited Mr. Garnero, this is Crook Garnero, who has just fled, to his Vail, Colorado World Futures meeting in August of 1982. That was 3 months after Licio Gelli was hung, and the world banks were going to collapse, a lot of them, and get very nervous. And Henry Kissinger had him in Colorado. This was supposed to be the turning point for debts, where they turned them into equity. Garnero opened the doors for Henry Kissinger on his Brazil visits. He was awarded Man of the Year award in 1984 by Rockefeller and their Chamber of Commerce, and honors continued between George Shultz and William Simon and Mr. Garnero down in Brazil and in the United States. The president-elect, Tancredo Neves, refused the bailout of the banks, and on March the 4th, the day that he was to take office, he put up papers to get Mr. Garnero, and he in turn went in the hospital, and the rest is history. There's another long story about the investments of Mr. Garnero, his relationship to George Shultz and William Simon in Executive Intelligence Review. I don't have time because time is running out. It says Garnero's association with Henry Kissinger goes back a long way. They were associates in 1964. I think I mentioned that last week, when Kissinger, the obscure Harvard professor, was giving lectures in Brazil. He was just wetting his toes. Vernon Walters, The CIA director had overturned that country right after Kennedy was killed, and they had put Brazil in the hands of the military dictatorship. And then Mr. Rockefeller, with his interest in South America, and of course J. Peter Grace's interest in South America, and William Simon and Gerald Ford, and various people from the Ford administration were down there working with Mr. Garnero. In this article tells about their meetings and their manipulation of money and their political recognition of each other. Mr. Vernon Walters, a Knight of Malta, William Simon, a Knight of Malta, and the scandals that go to George Shultz, the Secretary of State. And again, it's Henry Kissinger sitting with the President of the United States, having his lunch and grinning, and very conspicuously calling attention to themselves. And then 2 days later, this poor president, this would-be president, is with the Archbishop down in Brazil, has a dinner, goes home sick, has appendicitis, it isn't that at all, has 7 painful operations, and is dead. That is the way democracies don't go into functioning. They don't roll. We see it over and over again. It can't be coincidental. The same names, the same places, the same people that killed John Paul I wiped out this poor man. He's laid to rest by now. It is a tragedy. It's our tragedy. It happened in Dallas. It happens in Brazil. It happens again in Brazil. It'll happen all over the world until these people get what they want, which is their dictatorships. But there's no time for that now. Time is running out. The hour is running out, so I have to stop. This is Mae Brussell speaking to you from Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be with you next week.